The unwanted encounter. Robert Mathers strutted through the airport, his Italian leather shoes tapping rhythmically on the polished floor. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and glanced at his watch, a custom piece worth more than most people's cars. The world, as far as Robert was concerned, revolved around him. He was flying to Spain to finalize a major deal that would skyrocket his company, Mathers International, to the top of the Fortune 500 list. Life couldn't get any better. Reaching the first-class boarding area, Robert surveyed the passengers with a scrutinizing eye. He smirked at the sight of a few casually dressed travelers. First class isn't what it used to be, he thought, stepping confidently onto the plane. The attendant greeted him warmly, and Robert flashed a practiced smile, already envisioning the luxury awaiting him. As he approached his assigned seat, 2A, his smile faltered. Sitting in 2B was a black woman, her natural curls framing a serene face. She wore a navy business suit, her posture relaxed and confident. In front of her was a sleek laptop, and she appeared to be reviewing a presentation. Robert felt his stomach churn with annoyance. This is not the kind of person I expected to share this space with. He dropped his briefcase into his seat with a thud, intentionally loud enough to draw her attention. She glanced up briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to her work. That small acknowledgement made his blood boil. He turned to the nearest flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a professional yet kind demeanor. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice sharp. "There must be some mistake. I'd like to change my seat." The attendant looked at her tablet. "I'm sorry, sir, but the flight is fully booked. Is there a specific issue with your seat?" Robert leaned in, lowering his voice but ensuring it carried enough weight. "I don't want to sit next to her," he said, nodding subtly in the woman's direction. The attendant's expression didn't falter, but her voice grew firmer. "I'm afraid we can't accommodate preferences based on seatmates, sir. Everyone here has a valid ticket." "Do you know who I am?" Robert hissed, his frustration evident. "I'm the CEO of Mathers International. I don't think it's unreasonable to request a seat change." Before the attendant could respond, the woman in 2B spoke, her voice calm and even. "If my presence is causing you discomfort, sir, perhaps we should introduce ourselves. I'm Alyssa Carter." Her tone was professional, her demeanor unshaken, but her words only fueled Robert's indignation. "I don't care who you are," he snapped. "This is supposed to be first-class service." Alyssa raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, turning back to her laptop. Her silence only enraged him further. The attendant, clearly losing patience, spoke again. "Sir, we have policies that apply to everyone, regardless of status. You can take your assigned seat, or I can have security escort you off the plane. The choice is yours." Robert stared at her, momentarily stunned. He glanced around, noticing the disapproving stares of other passengers. The weight of their judgment pressed on him, and with a huff, he threw himself into his seat, muttering curses under his breath. The plane began to taxi, and Robert sat stiffly, his arms crossed, refusing to acknowledge Alyssa. She, on the other hand, opened a book and began to read, seemingly unbothered by the man fuming next to her. Her calm demeanor irritated Robert even more. How could she be so unaffected? As the plane ascended, Robert couldn't help but glance at her from the corner of his eye. She was engrossed in her book, occasionally jotting notes in the margins. Her calmness was unnerving, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Brewing tensions, the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and Robert's internal storm showed no signs of dissipating. He crossed and uncrossed his legs, tugged at his perfectly pressed shirt collar, and sighed dramatically. Beside him, Alyssa Carter remained composed, her focus glued to the pages of her book. She turned each page with a deliberate calmness that only seemed to amplify Robert's irritation. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, but for Robert, it wasn't silence. It was a deafening cacophony of his own thoughts. What is she even reading? He wondered, glaring sideways at the open book. Some self-help nonsense, No doubt. People like her love that inspirational garbage. Alyssa's pen scratched softly against the notebook on her tray table as she jotted a quick note. Robert craned his neck to peek, but her handwriting was tidy and small, impossible to decipher from his angle. She caught his movement and turned her head slightly, offering him a polite smile that sent a new wave of anger coursing through him. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked, her voice neutral but edged with something Robert couldn't place. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps pity. It made him bristle. "No," he snapped, turning away abruptly. "Just surprise someone like you would be so studious." Alyssa didn't respond immediately. She set her pen down, carefully closing her notebook and placing it atop her book. Her calm demeanor was unshaken, but her gaze was direct, unwavering. "Someone like me," she echoed softly. Robert hesitated, realizing his words might have landed poorly, but his pride refused to let him backtrack. "Yes, someone who, well, someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class." The tension thickened as his words hung in the air, and the other passengers in their row shifted uncomfortably. Alyssa's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to sharpen. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs elegantly, and clasped her hands in her lap. "Interesting," she said simply, her tone measured and controlled. "And what, exactly, makes you the arbiter of who belongs here?" Robert scoffed. "It's not about being an arbiter. It's about standards. First class is supposed to be exclusive, people with pedigree, success, not just anyone who can afford a ticket." For the first time, Alyssa allowed herself a quiet chuckle. It was subtle, barely audible above the hum of the engines, but it carried a weight that unsettled Robert. "Ah," she said, nodding slightly. "So success, to you, is defined by appearances and assumptions." Robert opened his mouth to retort, but the flight attendant returned, interrupting him. She placed a glass of water in front of Alyssa and then turned to Robert. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. "Nothing from you," Robert barked, waving her off dismissively. The attendant's expression didn't waver, but a flicker of something, disapproval, perhaps, crossed her eyes before she walked away. Alyssa, on the other hand, lifted her glass and took a sip, her composure intact. She set it down gently, her movements deliberate, and then turned to face Robert fully. "Mr. Mathers, isn't it?" she asked, her voice light but pointed. Robert froze, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. Alyssa tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Your outburst earlier was rather public. Hard not to hear your name when you shouted it for everyone to hear." Robert flushed slightly, but he quickly recovered, straightening his tie. "Well, now that you know my name, you should understand that I'm a man of significance. My company—" "Yes, Mathers International," Alyssa interrupted, her tone now cool and professional. "You mentioned that too. A multinational corporation, specializing in high-stakes investments, correct?" Robert blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Yes, that's right. What about it?" Alyssa's smile grew slightly. "Impressive. Though I find it curious that someone of your stature would let something as trivial as a seat assignment ruin his composure." Her words struck a nerve, and Robert felt his jaw tighten. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "Not particularly," Alyssa replied. "But I do believe in choosing battles worth fighting." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "And what would you know about battles? People like you don't understand the pressures of success." Alyssa raised an eyebrow, but didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she reached for her notebook and opened it again. "Success," she mused, flipping to a fresh page. "An interesting concept. Tell me, Mr. Mathers, what do you consider the greatest marker of success?" Robert scoffed. "Wealth, obviously. Influence, the ability to command respect." Alyssa nodded thoughtfully, her pen hovering over the page. "And respect, to you, is derived solely from wealth and influence." "Of course," Robert said without hesitation. "How else would you earn it?" Alyssa smiled faintly, jotting something down in her notebook. Fascinating, she said softly, almost to herself. Robert frowned, his irritation mounting. What are you writing? Just notes, Alyssa replied, her tone cryptic. A habit of mine. Their conversation lapsed into silence, and Robert shifted uncomfortably. Despite himself, he was curious about Alyssa's composed demeanor. She wasn't rattled by him, something he wasn't used to. He prided himself on his ability to dominate a room, to command attention and deference. But Alyssa seemed immune to his usual tactics, and it unnerved him. Meanwhile, a watchful eye, unbeknownst to Robert, another pair of eyes had been watching the interaction intently from a few rows behind. Samuel Ortiz, the president of international development for one of Spain's largest conglomerates, had a front-row view of Robert's outburst earlier. He had also taken note of Alyssa's calm response and her effortless poise in the face of such hostility. Samuel leaned toward his assistant, who was seated beside him. Remind me, he whispered, who's scheduled to present from Mathers International tomorrow. The assistant checked her tablet. Robert Mathers himself, sir. He's pitching the expansion strategy for their European markets. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. Interesting, he murmured. And the other candidate? Alyssa Carter, the assistant replied, her tone professional. Founder and CEO of Carter Innovations. She's presenting a competing proposal. Samuel sat back, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he watched Alyssa return to her reading. A faint smile touched his lips. It seems tomorrow's meeting will be more enlightening than I anticipated. As the plane continued toward its destination, Robert remained oblivious to the unfolding dynamics around him. For now, his world remained centered on his own frustrations, unaware that his actions were already reshaping the very future he thought he controlled. Unveiling the unexpected. As the plane cruised steadily toward its destination, the tension in first class began to settle into an uneasy calm. Robert sat rigid in his seat, his laptop open but untouched, the numbers on the screen blurred by his simmering frustration. Alyssa, on the other hand, remained composed, her focus unwavering as she turned another page of her book. In his restless state, Robert couldn't help but let his thoughts wander. He'd dealt with difficult people before, clients, competitors, even board members, but something about Alyssa unnerved him. She wasn't just unshaken by his words. She seemed utterly above them, as though his attempts to belittle her were irrelevant. It was infuriating. Who was she to act so confident, so untouchable? He glanced sideways at her, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of her notebook again. On the open page was a neatly drawn diagram, annotated with precise notes and calculations. It looked technical, sophisticated, nothing like the frivolous doodles he had assumed she was making earlier. What exactly do you do? He blurted out before he could stop himself. Alyssa looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she simply studied him, as though deciding whether to dignify the question with a response. Finally, she closed her book and rested her hands on her lap. I'm an engineer, she said simply. I specialize in renewable energy systems. Robert blinked, momentarily taken aback. Renewable energy? He repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. That's a pretty niche field. Alyssa raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Niche, perhaps, but vital, especially as the world moves toward more sustainable practices. Robert snorted. Sustainable practices don't pay the bills. Real money comes from industries that actually matter. Finance, tech, manufacturing. Alyssa tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. Funny you should say that. Renewable energy intersects with all of those industries. It's not just about sustainability. It's about innovation and long-term profitability. Robert bristled at her calm rebuttal. And you think you're going to change the world with windmills and solar panels? I think, Alyssa said evenly, that change doesn't happen by waiting for someone else to act. It happens when people see possibilities others overlook. Her words carried a quiet conviction that caught Robert off guard. He shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. Before he could formulate another cutting remark, the flight attendant returned to their row. "Mr. Mathers," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "would you care for a drink? Perhaps something to make the rest of your flight more comfortable." Her polite offer was clearly laced with an unspoken message. "You've made yourself uncomfortable, not her." Robert waved her off dismissively, muttering something under his breath. The attendant turned to Alyssa, her demeanor softening. "And for you, Ms. Carter." "A coffee, please," Alyssa said with a warm smile. "Black." The attendant nodded, her professional mask slipping just enough to show a hint of admiration. "Coming right up." As the attendant walked away, Robert frowned. "Carter," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Why does your name sound familiar?" Alyssa's expression didn't change, but her eyes glimmered with a hint of amusement. "It's a fairly common name," she said lightly, picking up her notebook again. "No," Robert said, shaking his head. "It's more than that. You're... wait." His eyes widened slightly as the pieces began to fall into place. "You're that Carter, the one competing for the Spain deal." Alyssa didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, she simply turned a page in her notebook, her calm demeanor intact. Robert, however, felt his blood pressure spike. "You're my competition," he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" Alyssa finally looked up, her gaze steady. "Because it wasn't relevant," she said. "I didn't think it mattered who I was. You seemed more concerned with where I was sitting." Her words hit like a slap, and Robert felt his face flush. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. For the first time, he found himself on the defensive, struggling to maintain his composure. The watchful observer. Several rows behind them, Samuel Ortiz leaned back in his seat, watching the interaction unfold with keen interest. Alyssa Carter's reputation had preceded her. She was known not only for her groundbreaking work in renewable energy, but also for her strategic acumen and unshakable poise. Her presence on this flight had been a pleasant surprise, but witnessing her handle Robert Mathers with such grace was an unexpected bonus. Samuel glanced at his assistant, who was taking notes on her tablet. "Add a note," he said quietly. "Carter Innovations. Emphasize their adaptability and leadership." His assistant nodded, tapping quickly on the screen. "And Mathers International." Samuel's expression hardened slightly. "We'll need to reassess. If their CEO can't handle himself professionally in public, what does that say about their internal operations?" The assistant hesitated. "Should I inform Mathers of the meeting review?" "Not yet," Samuel said, his tone thoughtful. "Let's see how the rest of this flight plays out. I have a feeling we're in for more surprises." The unfolding reality. Back in 2A, Robert sat in seething silence, his mind racing. He had spent months preparing for this deal, certain that his company's financial clout and his own charisma would seal the contract. But now, the realization that Alyssa Carter, poised, articulate, and clearly brilliant, was his direct competitor left him feeling unmoored. "So," he said finally, forcing a smug smile onto his face, "you think your little startup has a shot at beating Mathers International?" Cute. Alyssa didn't look up from her notebook. "Confidence is important in business," she said mildly. "But so is self-awareness." Robert's smile faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Alyssa said, closing her notebook and turning to face him fully, "that arrogance can blind even the most successful people. You may want to consider that before our meeting tomorrow." Her words were delivered calmly, without malice, but they landed like a hammer. Robert stared at her, his usual retorts failing him. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers again, their silent judgment pressing down on him. For the first time in a long while, he felt exposed, vulnerable. As the plane began its descent, Robert's thoughts churned. He had come onto this flight certain of his superiority, but now doubts crept in, unbidden and unwelcome. Alyssa Carter wasn't just competition. She was a force he hadn't anticipated. And as much as he hated to admit it, She had already outmaneuvered him in ways he hadn't even realized. A turbulent landing. As the plane began its descent into Barcelona, the cabin buzzed with the low hum of passengers adjusting their seatbacks, stowing their belongings, and murmuring about the sights they hoped to see in Spain. But in 2A, Robert sat stiffly, his mind racing with thoughts far removed from picturesque landscapes and business deals. For the first time in years, Robert Mathers felt uncertain. Alyssa Carter, his competition, had managed to dismantle his confidence with nothing more than grace and quiet confidence. It gnawed at him. He couldn't afford to let anyone, least of all her, jeopardize his long-coveted deal with Ortiz Enterprises. Meanwhile, Alyssa closed her notebook, tucking it neatly into her leather bag. She glanced out the window as the plane began its final approach, her expression calm, almost reflective. The contrast between her tranquility and Robert's visible tension was stark. She exuded control, a presence that unnerved Robert more than he cared to admit. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent landing. The passengers collectively braced themselves for touchdown, but the real turbulence awaited Robert outside the confines of the plane. The encounter at customs. As passengers disembarked, Robert hurriedly grabbed his briefcase, eager to escape the uncomfortable environment of the plane. Alyssa, unfazed by his rush, followed behind with measured steps, her professional poise intact. The queue at customs was slow-moving, and Robert found himself standing a mere few feet away from Alyssa. He avoided looking at her, but the proximity only heightened his agitation. Alyssa, however, seemed perfectly at ease. She exchanged pleasantries with a young couple in line, her laughter carrying a lightness that grated on Robert's nerves. "Long flight?" the customs officer asked as Robert stepped forward. Robert grunted. "Yes, and I'd like to get on with my day." The officer raised an eyebrow but proceeded with his checks. Robert passed through quickly, feeling a fleeting sense of relief as he stepped into the bustling arrivals hall. But his reprieve was short-lived. "Mr. Mathers," a deep voice called. Robert turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed man approaching. It was Samuel Ortiz himself, the CEO of Ortiz Enterprises, and the man whose contract Robert was so desperate to secure. Samuel extended a hand, his expression cordial but reserved. "Mr. Ortiz," Robert said, masking his surprise with a confident smile. "It's a pleasure to see you here. I wasn't expecting such a warm welcome." Samuel's eyes flickered briefly toward Alyssa, who had just stepped through customs and was now heading toward them. "I like to keep things personal," he said smoothly. "And this is an important week for us." Robert followed Samuel's gaze, and his stomach dropped as Alyssa joined them. She greeted Samuel with a handshake and a warm smile. "Mr. Ortiz, always a pleasure," she said, her tone effortlessly professional. "Alyssa," Samuel said, his demeanor shifting subtly. There was a respect in his voice that Robert hadn't heard directed at him. "I trust your flight was pleasant." "It was productive," Alyssa replied, glancing briefly at Robert. Her smile was polite but carried a subtle edge. Robert felt a wave of irritation. It was clear that Samuel already held Alyssa in high regard, and the realization only deepened his unease. The ride to the hotel. Samuel had arranged for a car to take them both to their hotel, a luxurious establishment in the heart of Barcelona. Robert had hoped for a private conversation with Samuel during the ride, but to his dismay, Alyssa was also invited to share the vehicle. The car was spacious, but the tension was palpable. Robert sat stiffly, his briefcase on his lap, while Alyssa reclined slightly, her demeanor relaxed. Samuel, seated between them, seemed to observe the dynamic with quiet interest. "I hope you're both ready for tomorrow's presentations," Samuel said, breaking the silence. "Ortiz Enterprises is looking for innovative ideas that align with our values. We're not just looking for numbers. We're looking for vision." "Of course," Robert said quickly. "Mathers International has always been at the forefront of innovation. Our track record speaks for itself." Samuel nodded but didn't comment further. Instead, he turned to Alyssa. "And Carter Innovations. What can we expect? Alyssa's smile was calm, confident. We've focused on creating solutions that address immediate challenges while paving the way for sustainable growth. Our approach isn't just about profitability, it's about legacy. Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. Legacy, he repeated. That's a word I don't hear often in pitches. Tell me more. As Alyssa elaborated on her vision, Robert clenched his jaw, his irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He had always relied on his company's financial clout to win contracts, but it was becoming increasingly clear that Ortiz Enterprises valued more than just numbers. Alyssa's ability to articulate a broader purpose was winning Samuel's attention, and Robert felt himself slipping further behind. A quiet reflection. By the time they reached the hotel, Robert was visibly strained. As Samuel and Alyssa stepped out of the car, engaged in easy conversation, Robert lingered for a moment, his thoughts a tangled mess of frustration and doubt. He had spent years building his empire, climbing the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency. Yet, in a single flight, Alyssa Carter had managed to challenge his entire approach. Her composure, her intelligence, her ability to command respect without demanding it. It was everything Robert wasn't, and it was working. As he finally stepped out of the car, he noticed Alyssa and Samuel waiting near the hotel entrance. Alyssa glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, Robert felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, insecurity. The calm before the storm. That evening, Robert retreated to his lavish suite, determined to regain his footing. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out at the glittering lights of Barcelona. Tomorrow's presentation was his chance to prove his worth, to remind everyone, including himself, why he was the CEO of Mathers International. But as he sat down to review his slides, his mind wandered back to Alyssa, her vision, her confidence, her ability to connect with people. It all felt like a direct challenge to everything Robert had built his career on. And as much as he hated to admit it, he wasn't sure he was ready to face that challenge. Meanwhile, in her own room, Alyssa prepared for the next day with quiet determination. She wasn't concerned about Robert or his tactics. Her focus was on her work, her vision, and the opportunity to make a difference. For her, the meeting wasn't about competition. It was about purpose. Tomorrow, their paths would collide again, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But tonight, Alyssa slept soundly, while Robert wrestled with the growing realization that he might be fighting a battle he wasn't prepared to win. Heat high-stakes pitch. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the grand conference room in one of Barcelona's most luxurious hotels. The room was abuzz with anticipation, filled with representatives from Ortiz Enterprises and industry insiders. At the head of the room, a sleek podium awaited the two presenters who would vie for the coveted contract. Robert Mathers stood off to the side, his tailored suit impeccable, his demeanor outwardly confident. He had spent the night revising his pitch, ensuring every financial projection and strategic initiative was flawless. Yet, as he glanced at Alyssa Carter standing a few feet away, his stomach churned. She exuded calm, her hands resting lightly on the binder she carried, her expression serene. Her presence alone seemed to unsettle him in a way he couldn't fully understand. Samuel Ortiz entered the room, his commanding presence immediately silencing the low murmurs. He took his seat at the center of the table, flanked by senior executives. His assistant handed him a sleek tablet as he gestured for the proceedings to begin. "Thank you all for joining us today," Samuel began, his voice resonating with authority. "We're here to determine the future of Ortiz Enterprises' renewable energy division. Both Mathers International and Carter Innovations have presented compelling proposals in their preliminary submissions. Today, we'll hear their final pitches." He turned toward Robert. "Mr. Mathers, you may begin." Robert's moment of truth. Robert strode to the podium, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and began. His presentation was meticulously crafted, filled with charts, graphs, and projections that painted Mathers International as a powerhouse of financial growth. He spoke with practiced ease, emphasizing the potential profitability of his proposal. Our approach, Robert concluded, is simple yet effective. Maximize returns, minimize risks. Ortiz Enterprises will see immediate benefits with our streamlined implementation strategy. The room responded with polite applause, but Robert noticed Samuel's expression remained unreadable. He returned to his seat, feeling a pang of uncertainty despite the flawless delivery. Alyssa's vision. Samuel's gaze shifted to Alyssa. "Miss Carter, the floor is yours." Alyssa stood and walked to the podium with an effortless grace that commanded attention. She placed her binder on the stand but didn't open it. Instead, she looked directly at her audience, her voice clear and confident. "Good morning," she began. "When I founded Carter Innovations, my goal wasn't just to create a business. It was to create a movement toward sustainability, innovation, and equity." Her word hung in the air, and Robert couldn't help but notice how the room leaned in, captivated. Alyssa clicked a small remote, and a single slide appeared on the screen behind her. It wasn't filled with numbers or charts, but a striking image, a solar farm stretching across a barren desert, transforming it into a hub of energy and life. "This," Alyssa continued, gesturing to the image, "is not just a project. It's a vision of what's possible when we think beyond short-term gains and focus on long-term impact. At Carter Innovations, we don't just ask, what's profitable? We ask, what's transformative?" Her presentation seamlessly wove together compelling stories of communities empowered by renewable energy, practical steps for implementation, and projections that were modest compared to Robert's but rooted in real-world application. She concluded with a statement that silenced the room. Ortiz Enterprises has the chance to lead not just an industry, but a global shift. The question isn't whether you can afford to take this step. The question is whether you can afford not to. The room erupted in applause, louder and more sustained than Robert's had been. Samuel Ortiz leaned back in his chair, his expression one of genuine admiration. The unraveling. As Alyssa returned to her seat, Robert felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping over him. Inadequacy. For years, he had relied on his financial clout and sharp tactics to dominate the business world. But today, he had seen something different, something he couldn't match. Alyssa's pitch wasn't just a presentation. It was a call to action, a vision that resonated with the very core of what Ortiz Enterprises seemed to value. Samuel stood, addressing the room. "Thank you both for your presentations. We'll deliberate and announce our decision shortly. In the meantime, feel free to enjoy refreshments in the adjoining lounge." The attendees began filing out, but Robert remained seated, staring blankly at the empty podium. He barely registered Alyssa's presence until she spoke. "Good presentation, Mr. Mathers," she said, her tone polite but distant. He looked up at her, his pride stung. "You think you've got this all figured out, don't you?" Alyssa regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about having everything figured out," she said finally. "It's about staying true to your values. Maybe you should consider what those are." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The decision. An hour later, the attendees reconvened in the conference room. Samuel Ortiz stood at the head of the table, his demeanor serious but calm. After much deliberation, he began. "Ortiz Enterprises has decided to move forward with Carter Innovations. Ms. Carter's proposal aligns with our values and vision for the future." The room erupted in applause, but Robert barely heard it. His face flushed as he forced himself to clap, his mind racing with a mix of disbelief and anger. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Samuel approached Alyssa, shaking her hand warmly. "Congratulations, Miss Carter. We're excited to work with you." "Thank you, Mr. Ortiz," Alyssa replied, her voice steady. "I look forward to what we can achieve together." As the crowd dispersed, Robert stood frozen, watching Alyssa engage effortlessly with Samuel and his team. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless, outclassed not by numbers or strategy, but by something far deeper: integrity, purpose, and a vision that extended beyond profit. A bitter reflection. That evening, Robert sat alone in his hotel room, a half-empty glass of scotch on the table before him. He stared at the city lights outside, their brilliance mocking the darkness settling over him. For years, he had defined success by wealth and power, believing those were the only measures that mattered. But Alyssa Carter had shattered that illusion in a single day. Her words echoed in his mind. It's about staying true to your values. For the first time in his life, Robert wondered if he even knew what his values were. Continue with Part 6, exploring Robert's attempts to reconcile his defeat, his reluctant admiration for Alyssa, and the path forward as he faces the consequences of his actions and beliefs. A lesson in humility. The next morning, Robert woke to the unwelcome glare of sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind. The flawless execution of Alyssa Carter's presentation, the rapt attention she commanded, and most painfully, the applause that marked her victory. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from his executive assistant read, "Call when you're ready to discuss damage control." Robert grimaced and tossed the phone aside. He wasn't ready to face the fallout just yet. The truth was, Mathers International had suffered a significant blow. Losing the Ortiz contract meant losing not just revenue but prestige. Investors would ask questions. Competitors would circle like sharks. And yet, as much as the loss stung, something deeper gnawed at him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Not just in his strategy, but in himself. An unexpected encounter. In an attempt to shake off his mounting anxiety, Robert decided to head downstairs for breakfast. The hotel's dining area was bustling, a mix of tourists and business professionals discussing everything from sightseeing plans to market trends. He scanned the room and froze when his eyes landed on Alyssa. She sat alone at a corner table, sipping coffee and reading from her tablet. For a brief moment, Robert considered turning around, retreating to the anonymity of his room. But something held him in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe, though he wouldn't admit it, it was the faint hope of learning what she had that he lacked. Summoning his courage, he approached her table. Alyssa looked up, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Mr. Mathers," she said, setting her tablet down. "Good morning." "Morning," Robert replied, his voice strained. "May I join you?" Alyssa hesitated for a beat before gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Of course." Robert sat down, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. He fidgeted with the corner of the napkin on the table. "I wanted to congratulate you," he began, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "Your presentation was impressive." "Thank you," Alyssa said simply. She took a sip of her coffee, her composure unwavering. Robert hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "How do you do it?" Alyssa tilted her head. "Do what?" "Stay so calm, so focused," Robert said, the frustration seeping into his voice. "You don't let anything rattle you, not even, well, people like me." Alyssa studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I've had a lot of practice," she said finally. "When you grow up constantly having to prove your worth, you learn to channel your energy into things that matter." Her words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't mean to be rude, to judge me." Alyssa interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "I know. People like you rarely do. But intentions don't erase impact, Mr. Mathers." Robert looked down at his hands, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. After a moment, he said, "I spent my whole career focused on winning, on being the best, and yesterday you made me realize that maybe I've been going about it all wrong." Alyssa leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "Winning isn't the same as leading," she said. "You can be the best at cutting corners, maximizing profits, and climbing the corporate ladder. But leadership, true leadership, is about inspiring others, creating something bigger than yourself." Robert nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I've always thought leadership was about control, about making sure things go my way. And how's that worked out for you? Alyssa asked, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. Robert chuckled bitterly. Not as well as I thought. An offer of redemption. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Samuel Ortiz, who approached their table with his usual air of authority. Good morning, he greeted, his gaze flicking between the two of them. Am I interrupting? Not at all, Alyssa said. She gestured to the empty seat beside her. Join us. Samuel sat down, setting a small notebook on the table. I have to say, yesterday's presentations were among the best I've seen in years, he began, his eyes on Alyssa. Your vision for renewable energy is not only compelling but necessary. Ortiz Enterprises is proud to partner with Carter Innovations. Thank you, Mr. Ortiz, Alyssa replied. I look forward to working together. Samuel then turned to Robert. And Mr. Mathers, he said, his tone measured. Your company's track record is impressive, but I believe there's room for growth, not just in numbers, but in approach. Robert stiffened, bracing himself for further criticism. But to his surprise, Samuel continued, Ortiz Enterprises values long-term relationships. If you're willing to reassess your strategy and demonstrate a commitment to the values we hold dear, I'm open to discussing future opportunities. Robert blinked, momentarily stunned. You give me another chance, he asked. Samuel smiled faintly. Business isn't just about contracts. It's about people. Show me you're willing to grow, and we'll talk. Alyssa glanced at Robert, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Robert felt a glimmer of something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. A new beginning. As Samuel left the table, Robert turned back to Alyssa. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet. For what? She asked. For not giving up on me, he admitted. You could have written me off after the way I treated you, but instead, you showed me what real leadership looks like. Alyssa's lips curved into a small smile. Everyone deserves a chance to change, she said. Even you. Robert nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt something other than ambition driving him. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, but one he realized he wanted to explore. The road ahead. Back in his hotel room later that day, Robert opened his laptop and began drafting an email to his team. It wasn't a list of demands or a recap of the loss. They'd get to that in due time. Instead, it was an apology. He acknowledged his mistakes, his narrow focus, and his failure to lead with purpose. He ended the email with a simple promise. We're going to do better, starting with me. Meanwhile, Alyssa prepared to meet with Ortiz Enterprises, ready to embark on a new chapter for her company. She didn't dwell on Robert or the events of the flight. Her focus was on the work ahead, the lives her innovations would touch, and the legacy she hoped to leave. As their paths diverged, one thing was clear. The encounter had changed them both. For Alyssa, it was a reminder of the power of resilience and integrity. For Robert, it was the beginning of a journey towards something he had never truly understood. Leadership rooted in purpose, not pride. And in the end, that lesson was worth more than any contract.